All right, today we're cracking open a historical cold case. The victim? Well, you could say it's the legacy of John Calvin, one of the biggest names in the Protestant Reformation. And the main suspects? His own followers. The charge is serious, betrayal. So, let's get into it.
So, this is the central question, right? For a long time, a lot of people thought that the generation right after Calvin took his revolutionary theology and basically forced it back into a rigid medieval box that he supposedly hated. Was this a massive betrayal? Or, like most good cold cases, is the real story a lot more complicated?
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the accusation, then look at the paradoxical evidence from Calvin himself. We'll figure out the motive, follow the trail of a few key figures, and then, finally, we'll deliver the verdict on this whole thing.
Okay, first things first, let's really understand the charge. The core idea here is that a huge gap opened up between John Calvin the man and the movement that ended up being named after him, Calvinism.
Yeah, for a huge chunk of the 20th century, this was the main story you'd hear. Historians called it the discontinuity view. The thinking went something like this. Calvin's ideas were fresh, dynamic, almost alive. But his successors, they got scared, or maybe just lazy. And they brought back the one thing he supposedly fought so hard against, medieval scholasticism. You know, that superstructured, philosophical way of doing theology.
And look, this wasn't just a vague feeling people had. Scholars pointed to what they saw as cold, hard proof. One of the most famous arguments came from a guy named Basil Hall. He claimed that Calvin's successor in Geneva, Theodore Beza, took a big idea like predestination and crammed it back into a rigid logical system, a classic scholastic device, totally betraying Calvin's original vibe. So the case against them seems pretty strong at first glance, but any good detective knows you got to look at all the angles.
Which brings us to our star witness, John Calvin himself. And when you really start digging into his work, you find a guy who seems to have two completely different minds about this whole thing.
On the surface, Calvin's feelings seem crystal clear. He absolutely hated scholasticism. Or at least that's what he said. He was famous for bashing the scholastic sophists. When one of his enemies, a cardinal, dared to call him a scholastic, Calvin was furious and fired back with insults like this one, calling it secret magic and mere sophistry. Pretty harsh words.
And this right here is the paradox at the heart of our case. On one side, you have Calvin in public just tearing scholasticism to shreds. But behind the scenes, in his actual writing, he was using its tools all the time. His education was soaked in this stuff. Modern research shows he borrowed heavily from medieval traditions, especially one called Scoticism, which is known for its super precise, logical arguments. So what gives? Well, the public attacks were probably a branding thing, a way to make the Reformation look new and fresh. But the key takeaway is this. Even as he publicly rejected it, he couldn't get away from it. It was baked into his DNA.
So that leads us to a really big question in this investigation. If Calvin was so against it, at least in public, why in the world did scholasticism make such a huge, open comeback just a generation after him? What was the motive here?
Before we go any further, we need to be really clear on what scholasticism actually is. It's not a set of beliefs. It's not an ism like Lutheranism or Calvinism. It's a method. Think of it like a toolkit for theology, a way to organize your thoughts using logic, precise definitions, and systematic arguments. It's the kind of thing you use in a university classroom or a formal debate, not so much in a Sunday sermon.
So why did this toolkit suddenly become popular again? Well, there are a couple of theories. One is the extrinsic or external reason. Calvin's followers were in these intense debates with some very sharp Jesuit thinkers, and they needed to fight fire with fire, using the same logical tools. But a lot of modern scholars think the intrinsic or internal reason is more important. The Reformation was growing up. It needed to get organized, to train new pastors, to clearly define what it believed. Scholasticism wasn't just a weapon to fight outsiders. It was a tool they needed to build their own house.
Now, this shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. And we can actually follow the trail of evidence by looking at three key theologians who show us how the attitude towards this medieval toolkit changed over just a few decades.
You can really see the progression here. In the 1580s, you have guys like Antoine de Chandoux who are kind of cautiously defending it. He's saying, look, there's a pure scholasticism we can use. It's not the bad papal kind. At the same time, you have Lambert Dano, who starts out using medieval thinkers just to attack them, but ends up actually citing them in a positive way. Then, by the early 1600s, it's a whole new ballgame. Amandus Polanis isn't just defending it, he's fully embracing it, trying to show a direct, positive link between medieval and Reformation ideas. The attitude clearly goes from defense to full-on adoption.
Okay, we've looked at the accusation, we've examined the evidence, we've followed the trail. I think it's time to deliver the verdict in our Calvinist cold case.
And the verdict is that the old black and white story just doesn't hold up. This wasn't a simple case of betrayal, but it wasn't a case of perfect, unchanged continuity either. The real story, the one the evidence points to, is one of complex evolution.
This table really sums it all up perfectly. Take a look at the top row, the explicit attitude. With Calvin, it's super negative. With his followers, it becomes more and more positive. But now look at the bottom row, the implicit use. It was high for both of them. Calvin was using the methods all along. His followers just started being honest about it.
So here's the bottom line. The later Calvinists didn't betray John Calvin. They were just building on the foundation he himself had already laid. They took the tools that Calvin used, the same tools from his own education, and brought them out into the open because they needed them to face new challenges. The big change wasn't in substance, it was in public relations. Case closed.
But this whole investigation leaves us with a really fascinating question, one that goes way beyond the 16th century. Calvin spent so much energy publicly rejecting a certain way of thinking, but its logic was all over his own work. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What ideas are we publicly rejecting today that are secretly shaping the very way we think?